CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of work, today we are going to talk about a very interesting dimension of work, that's alienation. We all work, we all aspire to become government servants, to work in private sector, to work in bank, to work in NGO, but somewhere we are all kind of feeling a sense of separation, a sense of estrangement, and that makes us think that are we satisfied with the work or the conditions of work that we are doing? What is the experience of work? And this takes us to a very important concept in sociology of work, and that's alienation. So alienation is kind of not something which is experienced only by the working class or something in the factory setup. In today's contemporary society, so-called information society, something that we discussed in the previous lecture, in terms of the overall impact of computers, automation, we know there is so much of surveillance, there is so much of monitoring, there is so much of reporting that somewhere we kind of feel ourselves aloof, we feel ourselves not related to the work that we are doing. Though many kind of corporate sectors have kind of made a lot of effort to ensure that the employees get a sense of belongingness, but then this is an issue which needs to be understood, and for this today we are going to first understand the concept of alienation, because it is something which is very critical or central to sociology of work, as most of the founding fathers, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, have somehow referred to the issue of alienation, because remember this entire transformation which was taking place from industrial society to post-industrial society, and basically there was a change in the modes of production from home to factory, and then we see to the service sector. So how has the dimension of work changed? And here when we talk about dimension, we need to kind of keep in mind that it is the experience of those working, and especially when we talk about say post-industrial society, or we talk about information society, and we see that today is a time of service sector, today is a time for more of white collar workers, but then can we kind of make a distinction between the blue collars and the white collars on the basis of the experience that they have? And that will help us to understand if we are able to know how we kind of locate alienation. Where do we locate it? Do we locate it only to the working conditions, or do we locate it in terms of experience, also in terms of supervisions that we are getting, or where do we place ourselves in the process of production? And that will help us to understand the level of alienation experienced by worker. So one of the reason why alienation becomes very significant is that the meaning kind of got lost because of this transformation, and a very positive convergent thesis which was put across by a number of scholars, that once industrialization takes place and there will be a tendency to converge, there will be computers, there will be technology, so that level of automation will ease our physical labor. We do not have to work so much, so we will get more free time, more leisure time, and therefore there will be a reduction in the amount of alienation. But when we kind of go through this and try to understand, we'll see towards the end of the lecture that automation, computerization, technology has kind of exerted an external pressure on our mind and subconsciousness, where we have kind of become almost like a slave, and all our activities, all our actions are now monitored, regulated by computers. And we can see this all around, especially during the pandemic, when the entire life is regulated by the technology. We get up morning by the alarm ringing on the mobile. Even we have apps made up which will tell you what time to drink water, what time to kind of do your activities. So the human agency has become kind of just following the instructions given by the computer and the information technology. So there we kind of feel a level of estrangement, level of separation from our own human species. And it's very important an issue or an important concept that we need to understand, because we see the number of suicide, the number of mental health issues that people around, and not only say people who are working, but we see adolescents, we see children are not being able to cope with the stress and for pressure that is created by the information technology, somewhere human interaction, the physical face-to-face interaction has been lost. We often see two people communicating, but they are talking, their lips are moving, but their eyes are concentrated on the mobiles, so they don't have an eye to eye touch, and that makes a lot of difference on our emotional and well-being. So it's need to understand how this is not something which has kind of just cropped up because of the online education or increased use of technology. This is something which a lot of people have worked, and most important, which we will kind of focus our attention, is on Karl Marx, because he's one of the person who kind of popularized this concept of alienation, which was experienced by the working class. But before we go to kind of Marx, we need to understand the relations between technology and alienation. And in order to understand whether people in or say working class or individuals in modern society are feeling alienated or are experiencing alienation, we need to answer three important questions. Number one, has recent advances in technology reduced or increased alienation? So are we kind of, because we have technology, because we kind of do everything from the kitchen work to the say hi-fi scientific laboratory work with the help of technology, are we having more and leisure? Are we more free to do what we wish to do? So there we need to understand, are we kind of more alienated, or are we kind of having a community feeling amongst ourselves? Number two, what types of modern work would we kind of look into as less alienating? So the general or commonsensical understanding is that alienation is something which we'll find in manual work, something which we will find in say factory, where workers are continuously working on the machine and they are kind of supervised, controlled by the management, and therefore the level of experience would be more. But this kind of would be incorrect. It could be an assumption. This level of alienation can be found across the class, across the people who are working, and depends on a variety of factors. The most important question, that is the third question, is how do we kind of understand the relevance of Marx, because Karl Marx brings in this understanding of alienation. But one kind of a limitation was that his understanding of alienation was more in terms of men experiencing alienation in the factory modes of production. How do we look into the gender, that is women's experience of alienation? Because as service sector has increased, we also have this concept of feminization of labor, where the number of women employed are kind of comparatively better than it was in the say in the industrial or pre-industrial mode. So can it then help us that there is some amount of gender inequality, or can we understand sexism in workplace? So there are different questions and different level of understanding in order to understand the concept of alienation. So before we kind of go into Marx, Durkheim and Weber, we kind of look into this term alienation. Alienation kind of is something which was not only a term which came in with industrialization, but it was earlier used in terms of kind of theological works such as the reformist leaders, people who were in the Reformation like Calvin, John Calvin and Martin Luther. And this alienation was in terms of kind of estrangement of humanity from God. So when we look at from a theological or say from the religious perspective, there was some amount of disconnect between God and humanity, and people were kind of engaged in their own kind of production and progress, irrespective of the desires of God. And then this concept becomes very familiar in social sciences, and people started kind of using this concept especially to understand individual behavior in the political realm, in the times of economic understanding, and also with the entire growth of urbanization. There was a kind of an evolutionary perspective which said that rural life was more community life based. So it was kind of more household, people people were more related to each other. As we move towards industrial urban life, it becomes individualized. People are more concerned about the individual problems. People are more concerned about their own profit and benefits. So there is a kind of lot of terms, Gesellschaft, Gemeinschaft, say community life to association. Lot of these terms were used in the social sciences to refer to this concept of alienation. But if we were to kind of refer to one particular work is of Hegel, and he kind of brings in this concept into the social sciences, and he refers to the term Entfremdung, which implies a sense of unbelief, a desire for kind of being very materialistic, a desire for kind of being very self-centered, self-oriented, and then for kind of says that it kind of many were looking into at as negative, but if we put it into the industrial thesis framework, then alienation could also be considered as positive, because community, family was considered as hindrance. It was considered as kind of taking you away from progress. So if you were individualistic, self-oriented and motivated towards your own interest, then you would be more progressive and more profitable. Now, if you kind of bring in specifically to the industrial sociology or sociology of work, the one name that comes very clearly is the work of Karl Marx on alienation. Well, we know, and we've done this first few lectures on Karl Marx, sociology of work, where he trying to looks into the relationship between capitalist production and alienation. And just to repeat, we know the core argument of Karl Marx is a materialistic interpretation of history, that as we move towards kind of more private property, private ownership of property, they kind of gets a division between the haves and have-nots. Haves are the capitalist who owns means of production, and the have-nots are the toiling people who are the working class who does not have any ownership. So this concept of alienation was specifically used for the workers, that is those who don't have any means of ownership. Why? Because the working class are dependent on the capitalist for their survival. So though they are doing the production, they are involved in the production of product, the product does not belong to them. It only belongs to the capitalist. Rather, even the labor that the worker is putting it is alien to him. So as proletariat, that is the bourgeois and the proletariat are the two terms he uses for the capitalist and the non-capitalist class, they kind of start losing control over the process of production. And if we know, go back to the theory on industrialization, we know industrialization, we have assembly like the Taylorism and scientific management theory tells us that there was assembly line production. That is, the work was fragmented and separated, and therefore the worker was kind of not being able to relate to the product that he himself was involved in. And therefore Marx argued that people become alienated from their work itself, because they kind of have no say. They have no control over the production process. They kind of are kind of just a cog in the machine. This is a phrase that Karl Marx used. They are just putting into the work and it passes on to the other. They have nothing to kind of innovate or add on something. They are only given certain instructions and they have to follow that. So it becomes kind of a self-concept and sense of well-being. So until and unless it's a kind of a psychological explanation that when you are involved in the production of a product, if there is any kind of defect, one tries to modify it, add on to it, and then when the final product is according to the desired result, one feels a sense of satisfaction, one feels satisfied about it. Here in the capitalist mode of production, the workers who are involved in the production does not have this satisfaction, and therefore there is a feeling of alienation. So the basic idea of Karl Marx was that human beings have kind of got this attribute of kind of producing for themselves, and that is what differentiates human species from the lower species. And for Karl Marx, capitalism kind of disturbed this natural arrangement. Why? Because then there was only those who had the capitalist modes of production or who own the modes of production could enjoy this, where the others were kind of not denied or were kind of exploited on this basis. So, the process of creating product, individual kind of if we say pre-capitalist period, they were kind of groups, households were engaged in production, and they were kind of required for their subsistence survival. But in the capitalist mode of production, the worker is only kind of oriented towards survival, his own survival. That is, he requires a value to his labor which is necessary for his existence. Beyond that, there is no sense of self-fulfillment and no personal satisfaction achieved from the work. So, the product does not belong to the labor, neither does the process, and neither does the person kind of the workers feel himself as part of the production process. So, in a very simple word, it can be said alienation according to Karl Marx was separation between capital and labor. So, there was a kind of very clear cut alienation taking place in kind of 4 levels. There are that one is that you get alienated from your own product. You do not have any say in the production. The product that you are processing, you are just adding a bit to it. So, for instance, in an assembly line production, if there is a manufacturing of a shirt going on, so to one particular worker, it only stitching of the buttons will come. So, the worker cannot feel the satisfaction of having produced that entire shirt. So, he is just one fragment in the entire process. So, the satisfaction is kind of minimal. The second is from the product of own labor. The workers are putting in labor, say 8 hours, 10 hours and even more, but they do not have anything in return of it in terms of kind of satisfaction, non-material gain, nothing. So, you are alienated from the process of production. From species being or from humanity and human potential, the human potential is much more. The potential is kind of not even allowed to do that. You are just kind of assigned a specific task and your wage or your compensation is according to the product that you have made. It is not also kind of able to compensate the labor, and therefore, the level of exploitation or appropriation comes here. Now, from other person, because there is kind of fragmentation and segmentation, we see that there is no kind of interpersonal relation between the workers and the other colleagues, and there is kind of no sense of belonging to a community. So, when we look into the first one, that is from the product of one's labor, according to Karl Marx, the capitalism has created products or object, and if we go into go in detail into the Karl Marx understanding, he would say that workers themselves becomes a commodity. It leads to a commodification or objectification of the workers, and there is a loss of the object that it is producing. The products belongs not to the producer, but to the capitalist who owns means of production. Even the what product you are getting, you are not going to kind of enjoy a profit over it, because the profit will again go to the capitalist. So, the product is taken away, the profit is taken away, and the labor himself becomes a fetish commodity. So, the entire capitalism is economic process which is going on generating wealth and accumulation of wealth for the capitalist, whereas the worker, who is an integral part in the production of the process, kind of gets towards the margin or towards poverty. So, the product of the labor belongs to the capitalist who uses it to create profits. Workers have no control over the product of what they are producing. The second is from the process of production from work itself. So, we know that because he is kind of only a part of the process, he is not the complete process. The product, the moment he does his part, the product is taken away from him and it is kind of passed on to the other. So, the act of production is active alienation. The moment you kind of sense that, okay, I can do this or improve this product, you will not be allowed to do it. It will move on to the next stage. Under capitalism, work is external to the worker and not part of the worker's nature. So it is not a fulfilling job. It's feeling of misery, exhausted because most of the time they are doing more labor, more than the required, and then they are not getting the compensation back in terms of the actual labor that they have done. So work at job becomes a means of earning. You're just doing your part. You are kind of say, if you are going to produce 10 shirts, you're just putting 10 buttons and buttoning on the shirts, and that what you get back as your wage or your salary is only a compensation for the basic minimal survival of the working class. So it just helps you to buy basic foods and necessities, nothing beyond that. So it is not an exercise of creativity. The worker is not feeling innovative, not feeling creative, and is kind of only doing the something which the lower species does, or we can say normal animal functions, eating, sleeping, extra, going to the factory, doing the work that is assigned, coming back. So there is a level of routinization, and therefore the human action or the human functions, that is creativity, thinking, has somewhere got lost. So the potential creative nature of human labor is kind of diminished, and the people becomes more in terms of non-human. That is, it kind of starts feeling there is a level of misery, there is a level of frustration in the human labor. The third form of alienation is from species being, or from humanity and human potential. That is, you can only be a human being when you can kind of count on your capacity or your skill to do something different. That is denied. So you do not have the freedom to do kind of express your mental capacity or to express your innovation. And because kind of human beings are self-conscious, they are thinking being, but that's denied to them. So you slowly and slowly, the essence of human being, that is creativity, the self-consciousness, starts kind of being separated from the human being, and there is only a physical need for survival. This kind of takes the workers away from species or the essential quality of human being. So the product is being alienated, the process is being alienated, as well as the human species, that is of being a human being, is also taken away from the workers, and it is kind of turns into a disadvantage to them. So because they are not conscious about it, they are not able to kind of voice their dissent against it, and they kind of continues that life of alienated labor as an alien being. It alienates from man his own body. This is a quote from Marx. It alienates from man his own body, external nature, his mental life, and his human life. And the fourth is the alienation from the community. So the working class kinds of does not find themselves in a community. So this relationship of exchange are social relations. So we kind of even when we are working, we interact as human beings. We share our pains, we share our sorrows. But there, when workers were working, and there is so much of supervision and so much of pressure to produce the requisite amount of product, that is efficiency and profit margin is very important, that they are not allowed to kind of talk to them or interact with individual. So workers are conscious of their supervision, that if they talk or do not do their work, the amount may be deducted from their wage. So they are continuously engaged in kind of doing the monotonous work without any human interaction, and this kind of takes them away. So what we talk about Karl Marx was, if we talk about Karl Marx in terms of providing a solution, the solution that he gave to kind of abolish this relation between alienating labor was to kind of give a private property. And if we go into deep details of theory, this awareness of class consciousness would arise, and people, working class, would become aware of the exploitation. They would raise in revolt, or they would kind of rise in a class conflict. And this class conflict, which is based on economic inequality, materialistic inequality, would kind of lead to doing away with the class differences, doing away with class inequality, and that would be in kind of create universal human emancipation. Other thinkers who have talked about alienation is Durkheim. Though he is not using the term alienation, he is using anomie. And we know anomie means meaninglessness, means normlessness. So Durkheim was more concerned about norms, about the collective consciousness. So he said when the society's norms kind of declines, it lead to anomie. People become meaningless, the life becomes meaningless. So there is a level of high increase in suicides. He gives us the understanding that there is too much of valueless society, there is no kind of community value. Then it would kind of lead to people kind of, and we see that over the years we see the number of suicide among young and adolescent people have increased. So there is some amount of understanding that norms have kind of failed to regulate society. The third thinker which is very important is Max Weber. Now Max Weber is not talking about alienation and anomie, he is talking about rationality. Rationality is that with modernity, scientific mode of thinking, everything becomes rational, everything is kind of have to have a logical scientific explanation, all action has to be have a rational explanation. And with this calculation, too much of control and everything, professionalization becomes kind of iron cage for human being. And the institution that Weber refers to it is bureaucracy. We have talked about bureaucracy in detail in the lecture on Max Weber. So bureaucracy as an institution for rules and regulation again controls human being, and that kind of leads to an entrapped with iron cage. So we look into rationality and bureaucracy from Weber as kind of leading to some amount of alienation, digitization, and so there were other theories as well which we will refer to in terms of understanding, because this is all the earlier theory. 20th century more of work has been done, but to understand alienation, this is the foundation to begin with Hegel, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and understand the concept of alienation and see it how relevant it is to understand modern society. So with this I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.